All right. So, for those of you who have been coming, this is, you know where we're at, but if you're brand new, I want to bring you up to speed a little bit. We have been studying the book, or the letter of Philippians. So, really, all it is a letter that a guy named Paul wrote to a city in the church in Philippi, which is in Greece, northern Greece, kind of northeastern Greece today, what we called Macedonia then. And he wrote it to them because he had visited them and he had shared the gospel there. And there were a lot that had said, I believe that, I'm in, I buy it. And the church began. And it was a very interesting church. And it wasn't easy. Paul got in trouble there. He was arrested, he was jailed, he was beaten. It was not a pretty experience. But Paul had been back there several times since then, helping them and encouraging them in their growth as Christians. And so what we look at this is that really, I think this book is all about perspective. Understanding, well, really perspective, the definition is this, is the capacity to view things in their true relations or relative importance. And that's something that we want to do. So when we look at life, there are highs and there are lows, right? And there are goods and there are bads in this world. And there are victories and there are defeats. And real question then is, how do we integrate this dichotomy that we live in every day? Every week, every month, we live in this dichotomous world of all this mixed stuff. When you go, how do we help figure this out? And so the answer has got to be by keeping perspective. You have to clear and understandable and reasonable and rational and realistic and honest perspective on life. And so how do you keep perspective? Well, you've got to see it from somebody's point of view. Either it's yours or somebody else's, or maybe there's even being able to see it from God's point of view. Maybe what if God was really there? And he has a better perspective. He sees it in a bigger picture than we do. You know, it's been said that sometimes, have you ever go to Europe, and a lot of the older buildings there, churches or castles especially, they have these giant tapestries that cover the walls. They're like old-fashioned wallpaper, if you will. And they were these giant, beautiful things that took forever to make. And from the front, if you look at them, they're incredibly ornate. They're beautiful. They depict some scene of kind of medieval Europe. But if you ever look at the back, you know, you take a sneak, and usually the docent who's there is like, hey, stay away from the tapestry, will you? But if you can sneak to the back and look at it, it's just a lot of loose strings, just stuff. You can kind of tell what it is, but not really. You know, and so then you get back to the front, and you go, oh, and guess what? Life is just like that. You and I look at the back side of the tapestry most of our lives. We're trying to figure it out. It's just a bunch of loose strings, and it's kind of crazy. And God can see the front of it all the time. He knows exactly what he's doing. We just happen to live on the back side of the tapestry. So it's all about perspective, and we want to see it from his point of view. Now, how can we discover his point of view? Well, we have to see it in his word as he gave it to us in the scriptures. And we see it most clearly in his son. Jesus describes it to really how to see life. And it's key what it's all about. Okay, so we're talking about a one-point perspective, and we've illustrated it with either of these pieces of art that we've had up front, but a one-point perspective, which is this. Some insights that help us begin to see how things might, should, could, will, and do fit together in our lives in light of the sovereign and redemptive purposes of Christ as he's working in us, both in eternity as well as in our daily living, through his truths of his word and the presence of his spirit. We can begin to get perspective on all of this thing. So now, here's where we've been so far, and I just want to kind of review it, because in this book, he's going to give us a variety of perspectives, right? And he's going to add them up and kind of tie them together so that we can make sense out of life. So the very first thing that we learned was this, is that he said, I am convinced of this, that he who began a good work in you will continue it until the day of Christ Jesus. What do we mean by that is that God isn't finished with us yet, that we're a work in progress. And that should be great news, right? God is not done with us. He is never finished with us until the day the Lord returns. He's still got work to do in our lives. Secondly, God will be faithful to do his part. God will be faithful to do his part in transforming our lives. And he wants to use the quality of love, ultimately, that will reveal his glory. There's something key about this issue of love. It's not just kind of a foofy word. It's not just kind of an add-on. It's not just a kind of an accident in life or the Christian life. Love is at the core of it. For these three things will abide forever, for a long time. Faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of them, Paul says, is love. And there's something critical about it for us to love. And why? And the reason it's so important is the reason it's so hard. And the reason it's so hard is because it's so critical that it's the thing that will kind of separate us. If we don't love, it separates us. If we do love, it draws us together. So it's all about love. And then the next point was that we are not victims of our circumstances, nor dissuaded by the ill intent of others, but we hang in there. That's life, and you have to do that. Next, we talked about this, the fact that our circumstances will work out to honor God as a result of us praying for one another and the reality of the presence of the Spirit. It's really important that we be praying for each other, caring for each other, lifting each other up. It really matters. That it's not just a waste of time, as a friend of mine said. You know, all this thoughts and prayers for people, it's worthless. Knock it off. It's stupid. And if there is no God, he's right. It's dumb. But if there is a God, then maybe prayer really actually helps. In fact, maybe it's really critical. And then the next week, we talked about this, that our lives have value, meaning, and purpose, even when they are accompanied by suffering. Our lives have value, meaning, and purpose. Yours does. In all the stuff that you go through, your life has value, has meaning, has purpose. Then the next week we talked about this, the fact that conflict produces humility, and humility allows conflict to be productive. It's true. Then last week we talked about this, the fact that the Christian life is not static, it's dynamic. We're always growing. We're always changing. In fact, we looked at this little kind of diagram and talked about your salvation. To work it out with fear and trembling, the fact that you're justified in Christ, someday you're going to be glorified in Christ, but in between those two things is this thing called sanctification, the process, and we'll call it this, the journey of being transformed. Life on this earth, between coming to Christ and dying, is this idea of a journey of us being transformed into the likeness of Christ. He is at work in us, around us, amongst us, but he is working in us to make us more like him. Wow. So this week, here's what I think the point of the passage is going to be. It's going to be leaders are made, not born. He's going to talk about two people today. He's going to talk about Timothy and Epaphroditus. And he's going to talk about the fact that leaders they're made. They're not just born. It's not just someone's born to be a leader. The fact that God transforms people and works in them and changes them to make them more like Christ and to make them a leader. But I think in this passage, we're going to find even more than a leader. It's more about this. It's more about lovers. And I don't mean this in a sexual fashion. I mean the fact that really what Timothy and Epaphroditus were is they were lovers of people. And that lovers are not made, are not born, they're made. God makes them into that. And if you take those two together, a leader and a lover, really what we turn out is that servant leaders are made, not born. Servant leaders are made, not born. These are leaders who love people. They're made, not born. Okay? I'm going to try to defend that big idea here as we get into this. So let's start with the idea that servant leaders are made, not born. We're in Philippians chapter 2, verses 19 to 30. And I don't want to be too academic with this today, because this is just so personal. Okay? So here let's go. Let's start in verse 19. Paul is saying this. Paul is in prison in Rome, right? He's writing this letter to them to encourage them and give them perspective on how to live life. So here he continues. He says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon. Timothy is with him there in Rome. Timothy had become a very trusted companion to Paul. And he's hanging out with him in Rome. And he says, I hope to send him to you soon. So, look at this, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. I hope I get to send him to you, not only so you're encouraged by Timothy, but so I'm encouraged by him coming back and telling me how you're doing. You see, they didn't have email, they didn't have FaceTime, they didn't have all that stuff. News traveled fairly slowly. And the fastest way to get something there was not to write it down, but was to write it down and send it with somebody. That's the fastest way to get it there. And then to have it come back. And he says, I want to hear about how you guys are doing. Verse 20, for I have no, look at this. This is an incredible statement. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. Now, you guys, just think about that for a second. Here Paul had been in the ministry for probably 35 years. He had traveled the world. He had taken all sorts of people with him. And right at this point in Rome, he says, I have nobody. There is no one like Timothy who will be genuinely, honestly, deeply concerned for your welfare. Only Timothy. You guys, that's an incredible statement to me. You think about all the other guys that he'd hung out with. And some of them weren't in town with him. But you think about Titus and Gaius and Silas, Barnabas, Luke. You just keep going on and on and on. And he says, I have nobody to send to be among you who genuinely is concerned for your welfare like Timothy. Wow, is that like the most amazing compliment ever? That just like blows my mind. Wow. And look in verse 21. It says, for they all seek, these other people, they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. Now, he'd already mentioned earlier in the book about these leaders that were causing him problems, that were undermining him, attacking him, and trying to kind of mess the whole thing up. And he's saying all of them had their own interests, but I know that Timothy has your interest in mind. I know he has your welfare in mind. Look at this in verse 22, the next page. But you know Timothy's, and I'm going to circle it here, proven worth. His proven worth. Look at this. Now, as a son with a father, now Paul was not his literal father, but he was his spiritual father. But his relationship had developed so deeply that he is saying to Timothy, we have been so close that it's like a father-son relationship. And he has served with me in the gospel. He has spent probably, at this point, at least 20 years traveling with Paul and serving as an apprentice under Paul. And they had become very, very close. It's an amazing thought, isn't it? Wow. He says, I don't have anybody like him of proven worth who will serve in the gospel. Verse 23, I hope therefore to send him to you as soon as I see how it will go with me, as soon as kind of my situation here is figured out, whether they're going to execute me or let me go. I'll send him to you as soon as that's kind of settled, as soon as the sentence comes down, basically is what he's saying. And then in verse 24, and trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come to you also. He thinks it's going to turn out well. He thinks he's going to get let go. And in fact, it looks like historically he did get let go for several years. He was rearrested and then executed later, but that this really did happen. And he said, boy, I want to send Timothy to you as soon as I can, and I hope to be able to come myself. Now, I want to just take a second, and I want to give you a timeline of Timothy's life, as best we can tell. Now, there are people who interpret it a little bit differently, but I think it gives us an understanding of why Timothy, we could say he was a person of proven worth. And I'd like to ask the question, what does it have to do with today? So here's Timothy's life. First of all, we think he was born in 17 AD. He was born in Lystra, which is in the middle of Asia Minor, which is what modern-day Turkey. And that's where he grew up. And on Paul's first missionary journey, he went through Lystra, and it looks like his mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois were won to the faith, that they became Christians. And so Timothy continued growing up in this Christian environment. Now, his mother is Jewish. His father is a Gentile. So usually you are Jewish if your mother's Jewish. Not your father, it's your mother. And so in a sense, Timothy is Jewish, but he's never been circumcised because he has a Gentile father. And so it's kind of a mixed bag. But he's born in 17 AD, and then he dies in 97 AD. 80 years later, he dies, and he dies in Ephesus. An older man, but not a man without great courage. The history tells us that when he was 80, there was a pagan celebration going on in Ephesus, which Ephesus was famous for. All sorts of mysterious religions and all sorts of worshiping of pagan gods, and that there was one going on as they were worshiping Diana, the goddess of love. And you can imagine what it probably looked like. It was a sexual, chaotic, crazy environment of which and Timothy, he had been ministering there for years, but he had been fighting against it. But Timothy finally is like, man, I can't take it anymore. And so he steps into the middle of this pagan celebration, and he begins to stand out against it and preach the gospel. And history tells us that he was beaten in the streets, and he was dragged through the streets. And at the end of the street, he was stoned to death in 97 as an 80-year-old man and buried on a mountaintop outside of Ephesus. Wow. That's incredible. But during his life, this is kind of how it unfolded. In 45 AD, he comes to faith on the first missionary journey, probably as a result of that journey with his mother and his grandmother. He's probably at that point somewhere between 20 and 30 years old. A lot of modern day stuff, we try to say that he was simply a teenager, but if you put the timeline together, it's probably not true that he was just a teenager. He was probably a person who had been through a significant amount of understanding who he was and grown. And he's probably between 20 and 30, maybe even 25 and 30 years old when he comes to Christ. He's a single man, which would be very common for that day and age. Men married later, women married younger. We see that. And then 5 years later or so, Paul and Silas come back on their second missionary journey, and when they get to Lystra, they find this guy named Timothy, who's probably, let's say, roughly 30 years old. And they find it, and he's grown in the faith. And they say, hey, Timothy, why don't you come with us? The elders have told us that you're a young man of great stamina, of great character. Why don't you come with us on our mission? And Timothy packs it up and he leaves with them. And he spends the next 20 years traveling with Paul. Is that amazing? Then we find that in 65 AD, as we find Paul in Rome, that Paul writes, not only has Timothy there, but Timothy also is serving in Ephesus, and he writes him 2 very incredibly personal letters, encouraging. But you know what? Timothy at this point is probably in his 40s, maybe even as old as 48 years old. And he relates to him as kind of a younger man, obviously younger compared to Paul, but also young in his leadership. Because then there was a whole different view of development than we have today. And he writes to him, he's probably between 40 and 50 years old. Then he writes to the Philippians when Paul comes and visits him. He's probably almost 50 at that point. Wow. Here's what I'd like to do. I think this is important. I think this is key. I'd like to superimpose the stages of development that I've talked to you about before, and I'd like to apply them here, because I think Timothy fits it perfectly. Here are the stages of development. That between the ages of 0 and 20, the key event in a person's life is learning their identity. Learning who they are. Now, it doesn't mean they just sit around and do nothing. Of course, we're active people. We're doing all sorts of stuff. But sometimes I think we think it's all about learning and growing. When it is about learning and growing, but it's also key about learning their identity. If we look at our culture today, the challenge as to the identity of young people is maybe one of the most important things that we're dealing with today. We live in a culture that says, in no uncertain terms, to a lot of young people, you are worthless. You're unimportant. You're usable. You're dispendable. We're going to put you on the sex market, and we're going to use you because you're not important. Or we live in a culture that says, you're more important than everybody else in the entire world. We think you are the greatest thing that's ever happened to the entire world. Rather than saying, no, you're in development. Your identity is critical. You're not the hottest thing that ever happened, but you're not worthless. That's what we say to people. We're saying to people today, who God made you is unimportant in the fact that you can throw it away. The fact that you are made female doesn't matter. You know what? I think it's one of the greatest lies of our culture. God made them. It says it in Genesis. God made them male and female, right? And I tell you what, being a gal is cool. It is awesome. I don't know. I'm not female. But I'm telling you, I know a lot of them. I know a lot of these gals. And, uh, and being a gal is one of the most beautiful, incredible, most fantastic things. You guys, is it amazing, really? Let's face it. God made this female body to be able to carry a human being inside of her. Now, I got to be honest with you. I want to talk to the Lord about this. I think it's a bit bizarre. I think an egg would have been a much better idea. You know, something you could just kind of have and sit on and let it grow. I think it makes more sense to me. Inside of you, this is like an alien in here. Like, are you kidding? And it's going to be bouncing around and pushing, you know. And I mean, I think it's a little nutty. But God made a woman that way. Is that like one of the most incredibly beautiful things? I remember moving here to St. Louis, and I was listening to the radio, and there was an OBGYN talking on the radio, and he was clearly not a Christian. But when he said, you guys, the female body is the most fantastic thing ever. What it can do and the way it works. It's amazingly complicated. It's incredibly beautiful. Being a woman is awesome. And being a guy, it rocks. Being a guy is so neat. And that was God's design. And we live in a culture. Now that's nature, right? It's nature. God made us that way. And we have thrown that away. It doesn't matter. It's not important. In fact, it's probably a mistake. And we have forgotten to celebrate who God made us. And your identity as a person is so important. So parents, what we're doing with our kids is not making sure they get on the best baseball team. It's understanding their identity as a person. And they're all different, right? All our kids are way different, right? And being a guy is it's bigger than we understood. It is not about being Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's not about being Jack Bauer. It's not about wearing camo. It's not about making sure that we shoot things. Now, for some guys it is. That's part of it. And that's great. But not everybody likes shooting things. I don't like shooting things. It's not my thing. Those of you who like to shoot things, it's great. Of course, some of you gals like shooting things, but you know, but there's a beauty. I have one son who is incredibly creative. He's artistic. The idea of camo, it's just not his thing. I have another son who's much more about that, but one who's a lot about music. My daughter's the one who likes to punch things, you know, but she's the one. But it's just uniquely beautiful. It's all about identity, right? The next 20 years, between 20 and 40, is all about learning and growing. It's all about learning and growing. And it's just, experiencing. That's why in your 20s to your 40s, it's all about taking risk, and it's all about adventure, and it's all about getting married, and it's all about figuring it out. It's all about getting a job and growing and learning. It's all about that. And sometimes we think, no, it's about settle down. Settle down, get a functional wife, get a functional dog, and have her sit around and function. No, it's about learning and growing. It's about expanding your experience. It's about all that, about learn and grow. Because if you know who you are and you learn and grow, then you can get to that next 20 years. These are rough, right? These are just approximate. But you can get to that place of wielding influence. You can wield influence because you know who you are, and you've learned and you've grown. Sometimes through failure, sometimes through success, sometimes just doing things. I love the story when Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, was in his early 20s. He was a little bit rebellious. He was wearing long hair and he was smoking and he was driving Billy a bit crazy. And one day he came home from a trip and he's like ready to read Franklin the Riot Act. And his wife, Billy's wife, took him aside and said, "Hey, look, hair is not a moral issue. Billy, remember, hair is not a moral issue." And he said, "Yeah, that kid's driving me nuts." He said, "Well, why don't we put him on an adventure?" And so there was a guy who needed to drive a brand new Mercedes from Paris to Tehran, Iran. And they said, "Take Franklin with you. Get him out of here." And Franklin went to Paris and he took this amazing trip through communist East Europe all the way to Tehran to deliver this Mercedes to this guy. in the ministry. What an incredible adventure. And along the way, Franklin began to see that God's bigger than my life. Where I'm headed is not so great. It's all about learning and growing. Not as a punk, not as a little kid, but learning and growing, which brings you to a place of having influence. And then in our culture, after 60, you're just supposed to go away, right? Just go away. I don't know where you go, but just go away. Here's the deal. Because of your identity and because you learn and grow and because of your influence, you have great wisdom to offer to those who are trying to figure out their identity, to those who are learning and growing, and to those who are wielding influence. You have great things to offer in your wisdom. Now, you guys, we've superimposed this on top of Timothy's life. Look at it. He's almost lived it out perfectly. He spent the first 20 years of his life learning who he was. In the midst of that, he learned his need for Christ, and he came to Christ early in his 20s. And he began to grow and learn. He went on an adventure for 20 years with Paul, learning and growing. And then, in the middle of his time as an influencer, he says, I have no one else to send to you of proven worth that cares for your welfare but Timothy. Because he could come to Philippi and he could exercise influence. Not power or authority, but influence. Because they recognized who he was. That's why he could go to Ephesus for the rest of his life and be the first bishop, if you will, of Ephesus. And he wielded his influence and his wisdom as he gave his life. And at 80 years old, he walks into a crowd and boldly proclaims Christ, and they stoned him to death. Wow. I'm afraid that we have forgotten that identity is the key, and we move right on to learn and grow, but if we don't know who we are, we'll never get there. And if you don't know who you are and don't learn and grow properly, you will never wield influence. And if you never do any of those, you will never have wisdom. And I think we find here that the developmental stages of Timothy was really critical, right? Okay. You guys, let me go on. We're going to talk about Epaphroditus. Here's a cool guy. We don't know as much about him. It's the only place in the scriptures we hear about him. Nowhere else do we hear about Epaphroditus. But here he says, I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus. And look at the descriptions of him. It's really cool. My brother. He wasn't literally his brother, but he says, this is like a brother to me. We're connected. There's a heart connection here. Not only my brother, but he goes, also my fellow worker. This guy knows how to work. He is willing to labor for the good of people. Wow. My brother, my fellow worker, and my fellow soldier. He knows how to take on danger. He knows how to live. He knows how to serve. He knows who is over him, and he knows how to give, like a soldier knows how to give. And not only a soldier, but he goes, and you're a messenger. He's been a messenger from you to me, and he has ministered to my needs. He has sacrificed. Wow, that's an incredible thing. This guy must have been really unbelievable. And look at this, and he goes on, for he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. And in fact, in his trip, and when he got to Rome, he got really sick. In fact, look at this. Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him. And not only on him, but also me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. He goes, man, I'm already dragging. It's hard to be in prison. But if I were to lose Epaphroditus, if he were to have died, it would have just crushed my heart. So glad he didn't die. Wow. Look at this in verse 28. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, that I may be less anxious. Now, I don't know about you, but let's circle anxious and let's put a question mark. Don't the scriptures tell us not to be anxious? Right? Didn't he tell us not to be anxious? And all of a sudden he's telling us he is anxious. And I'm thinking, Paul, what the heck, man? In fact, it's right in Philippians 4 that he says, don't be anxious. Look at this, chapter 4, verses 4 to 6. He says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious, circle it, about anything. But in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Well, what's the deal? He says, I'll be less anxious. And then he says, don't be anxious. Here's the deal. These are two different Greek words that we translate into English, anxious. The first one, to be less anxious, means to be concerned and grieved. Sometimes I think we as Christians say, hey, don't be anxious. Don't be human. Don't struggle. Don't wrestle with stuff. Don't be anxious. It's kind of like a Band-Aid we put on life. Don't be anxious for anything, but by prayer and supplication, let your request be made known to God, and with all thanksgiving, and it'll all go away, and it's all going to be great. And so just stuff it, will you? Just stuff it inside. And here he says, man, I'm really been anxious. I've been concerned and grieved over not only his sickness, but over his ache to come back to you and your desire to see him. Man, I'm really glad that I'm going to send him back because I'll be less anxious, less grieved, less concerned, because we'll settle this thing. Wow, it's so human. I love that. Really human, right? This other word in Philippians 4, it says, don't be anxious. That Greek word means the tearing apart, the ripping apart, the separation. And it's that anxiety in us that tears us to shreds, that tears us piece from piece. He says, now don't do that. He says, but by everything, by prayer and supplication, God's in charge. You can trust him. But he says here, man, I've been anxious. And I'm glad to send him back because I'm going to be less concerned, a little less worried, like a father for his son. And then in verse 29, look at this. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men. For he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. He did it for you when you couldn't. These are men to honor and rejoice over. Here's the deal. So here's what I'm trying to say this morning. Leaders are made, not born. Lovers are made, not born. Servant leaders are made, not born. And in spite of all the highs and lows and the goods and bads and victories and defeats of life, that Paul believes, and so do we, that God is trustworthy, that he's inclined towards us and not against us, that he's living with that in mind. As we live with that in mind, that we can set our direction and establish our stability, even when the world is out of control. So here's what I'd like to wrap it up with this, a couple of thoughts. First of all, God is committed to developing our proven character rather than our convenient comfort. He's more committed to our proven character that's in us than our convenient comfort around us. I don't know about you, but that pushes back against this culture, doesn't it? I mean, you gotta go, that just sounds so not appropriate. Let's not do that part. And it does push back against our culture, doesn't it? If you're a boomer, a lot of us are boomers in here. Francis Schaeffer says the values of a boomer are personal peace and affluence. That's what we bought into. And I'll have to be honest with you, I think it's true. And I think I bought it. My goal was personal peace and affluence, thinking it would answer the issues of my life. And it never did. Other social commentators have said that for the millennial, that their values are personal pleasure and appeasement. They've given up on the affluence because they're never going to have as much as their parents or their grandparents had. So they're going to have personal pleasure. And they'll live by a value of tolerating whatever to appease the culture. And so the fact that God is more committed to our proven character that's in us rather than our convenient comfort around us goes against the culture that all of us live in. Every one of us. But he's more committed to you on the inside than he is to you on the outside. That's a hard one to swallow. Secondly, proven character equals truth plus grace plus time. It takes time. Proven character isn't done overnight. It's not done by talent or skill. It is done by time of proving yourself to be reliable and trustworthy. Committed. That's what Timothy lived out. That's what Epaphroditus lived out. It was truth, yes. It was grace, yes. And it was time to be that kind of person, not just a teenager. It takes time to prove that character. And last, but not least is this: proven character learns to seek the welfare of the community rather than his or her personal interests. Proven character sacrifices for the good of others rather than making sure they get what they want. And that's what Paul found, is that no one around him, everyone else around him had personal interests that they were trying to accomplish, except for Timothy, except for Epaphroditus. They were committed to the good of the people, at even the cost to themselves. You guys, this is so anti-cultural, against the culture today. It's stunning. But this is what we've been called to. This is what he's lifting up Timothy and Epaphroditus. So here's the bottom line. Servant leaders are made, not born. So here's the question I have for all of us. Where is God working in your life? Is he working in the world of your identity? Making sure you know who you are, no matter what the world says or what it does, you know clearly and strongly who you are. Is he working in the area of learning and growing, putting you through some of those growing pains, those hard things, those good things, those risks, those adventures? What's he doing in you to help you grow, learn and grow? What about in your influence? Where's he stretching you? Where's he using you? What about in your wisdom? Is he asking you to bring it to the table and help other people? Or did you skip some of these stages and you really don't have much to offer? And you want to go back and say, God, I need you to work in my identity. I need you to help me learn and grow. I need you to help me have influence that's worthwhile, or to give me wisdom. Where is God working in your life? Because he wants to work. He wants to transform you. Where's he working in your life? Here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about it. I want you to write it down, and I want you to look at it every day. This week. Write it down. Put it on the mirror in your bathroom. Think about it. What's God doing in you? Because he wants to use you. He wants to transform you. He wants us to make us more like his son. What's he challenging in your life? Let's pray. Father, it sometimes rattles our cage, stretches our comfort zones. It makes life difficult to engage you. We wish you were more tame. We wish you were more manipulatable. We could manipulate you. We could tell you what to do. We want that. We want to tell you what to do. But you want to transform us. You want to take us over a period of time and begin to make us new and different. Not our personalities, but our character. Our understanding, our commitments, our reliability, our proven worth, that you want to develop that. We don't really like that, Lord. Let's be honest. We don't like it. We don't want that. But it is probably worth our while. Because, Father, I don't want to come to the end of my life and have it be a waste. Having taken the easy way out, having not faced the issues of my life, having not dealt with them and let you grow me, about having an influence that's only skin deep, but has no substance to it. That our wisdom would be absolutely absent. There'd be no wisdom to give. So, Father, would you take us, guide us, hold us, transform us? Father, we need your grace, but we need your truth, and we need time. Would you make us people that have proven worth like Timothy? Would you make us like Epaphroditus, who would be people, a person who would be a brother, but also a worker and also a soldier and a messenger and a minister to the needs of people? Could we be like that? In a world that has desperate needs and huge, dark places, may we be light that transforms. Father, I pray for the young people, for students in here, that they would be more interested in you than in being popular. that we as adults would be willing not to simply live in appeasement, but to live boldly. Father, it's not about our own personal peace or affluence. It's about what you want to do. So would you guide us that way? We need you. We trust you. And we will walk an adventure with you.